It was supposed to be a simple birthday celebration for my brother, Jason. I didn't think it would turn into a full-blown family drama. But when my parents and siblings started to pressure me into covering $3,100 for the event, everything shifted. They insisted it was my responsibility because I made the most money and could afford it. I wasn't about to spend that much on a party, especially for someone who hadn't even asked me to help in the first place. When I finally said no, the fallout was immediate. 3 days later, I got a call from my mom, and she sounded furious. "How could you let your brother down like this?" she snapped. It was clear she wasn't calling to ask how I was, just to guilt-trip me into doing something I wasn't comfortable with. Jason hadn't even mentioned the cost to me, and I couldn't help but feel like my family had crossed a line. I kept telling them no, that I had other plans for my money, but the guilt trips just kept coming. I never realized how much my family's perception of me revolved around money until this moment. They made me feel like I owed them, that I owed Jason this extravagant gift. I knew I was the one being unreasonable, in their eyes, but it felt like an unfair demand. By the 5th day, I couldn't escape the constant barrage of messages from my siblings, trying to guilt me even more. "It's just one party," they'd say, like that somehow made $3,100 reasonable. I kept thinking about how this was about more than just the money. It was about how easily they assumed I'd bend to their will. The way they all turned on me for saying no, it felt like I was being punished for setting a boundary. Then, something happened that made the situation even worse. I was at work when my dad called me, practically screaming down the phone. He told me Jason had been in tears, devastated that his own sister couldn't do something simple for him. The guilt hit hard, but deep down, I knew I had made the right call. But every day felt like a battle of emotions, torn between standing my ground and giving in to family pressure. I thought about it for days, weighing the consequences of either decision. My family was acting like my refusal was the end of the world, but I knew I couldn't afford to let them dictate how I spent my money. Yet, their emotional manipulation left me feeling drained, like I had no real say in what happened next. In the end, I didn't cave. I refused to back down, no matter how hard they pushed. But the silence from my family after I made my stance clear was chilling. They were no longer speaking to me the same way. Every call, every message, it was as if I had become a pariah. I hadn't anticipated this coldness, but I also realized I couldn't go on living in their shadow. The silence from my family wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. At first, I tried to push it out of my mind. I focused on work, on my own life, and pretended like everything was normal. But deep down, I could feel the weight of their disappointment hanging over me. It was like they were treating me as if I'd committed a grave sin, all because I refused to give in to their demands. The days dragged on, and I couldn't help but feel this growing distance between us. I'd see photos on social media from Jason's birthday party, my parents smiling in every picture while Jason looked perfectly happy, surrounded by their friends. It made my stomach churn. They'd gone ahead and thrown the party, completely ignoring the fact that I wasn't involved, that I had been pushed out of it entirely. The worst part? They didn't even thank me for the gifts I had already sent. The absence of acknowledgement made me feel like an afterthought. A week later, I got a message from my sister, Lisa. Her tone was different this time, no longer accusatory, just cold. She didn't ask about my side of things, she just wanted to let me know how upset Jason was, how he still felt abandoned. It was as if she was trying to guilt me into reconciling, but instead of sympathy, all I felt was frustration. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't the villain in this story, but at the same time, I felt trapped by her words, like I was failing to be the perfect sibling they wanted me to be. I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't care. The weeks went on, and the coldness from my family didn't fade. They would call me for small talk, but it was obvious that they were just going through the motions, trying to act like everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. They'd ask about my job, about my life, but they didn't ask about me, they were only checking in to make sure I hadn't changed in a way that made them uncomfortable. It felt like I was being slowly erased from their lives, one awkward conversation at a time. The emotional toll was starting to get to me. I wasn't used to being the black sheep, the one they all turned their backs on. The family dinners were the worst, though. When I went over to my parents' house for dinner, there was always an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. No one brought up the birthday party, but you could feel the weight of it, like an elephant in the room. I knew I had to break the tension eventually, but I didn't know how to begin without admitting that I felt utterly betrayed by the way they had treated me. Finally, one evening, as I sat there at dinner with them, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I looked at my dad, who was meticulously cutting his steak, and just said, "You don't think I'm angry, do you? That I've been made to feel like I don't matter to this family because I couldn't drop everything to pay for something I didn't believe in?" The room fell dead silent. My dad put his knife down, but no one spoke right away. Jason was the first to speak up, and for the first time since the party, his voice wasn't filled with anger. He sounded almost sad. "I don't know what I expected," he said quietly, "but I didn't expect you to turn your back on me." And that was it. The floodgates opened. We all started talking. The truth came out, how my parents had pressured me, how they'd never even considered how I felt about the situation. I was surprised by how much I was heard, and yet, I couldn't ignore the quiet realization settling in my gut: there would always be a price to pay for my choices. A price in the form of my family's approval, and a price that I wasn't sure I was willing to pay anymore. The days after that conversation felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between two worlds. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of clarity, but also a deep sadness. My family was trying to make amends, or at least, pretending to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things were never going to be the same. I had spoken my truth, but I wasn't sure they fully understood it. Jason called me the next day. He apologized for how he'd acted, though it didn't feel like a full apology. It felt like he was doing it because he thought it was what I wanted to hear, not because he truly understood how hurtful it had been. I told him that I wasn't mad at him, but that it wasn't just about the money, it was about respect, about boundaries. I told him I wasn't going to allow myself to be guilt-tripped anymore, even if it meant standing alone. His silence on the other end of the line said everything. He didn't get it. He just didn't get it. After that, I started pulling away more. I couldn't stay in a space where I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells. The more I thought about everything, the more I realized how much I had compromised myself over the years just to keep the peace. I had allowed their expectations to define me, to trap me into this role of the reliable, generous sister who could always be counted on. But that version of me was starting to crumble, and I didn't know if I could ever get it back. There were still moments of hope. I'd get a text from my mom here and there, asking how my work was going, asking if I wanted to join them for dinner. But every time I saw their names pop up on my phone, I couldn't ignore the underlying tension. It was as if the last few weeks had opened a wound that couldn't heal, no matter how much time passed. One day, I found myself scrolling through social media, seeing yet another post from Jason about his birthday. This time, it wasn't just the pictures from the party, it was a long, heartfelt post about how grateful he was for his family, how much he loved them, and how lucky he was to have them in his life. And there it was, this subtle but clear jab: asterisk couldn't have asked for a better support system. Some people really come through for you when you need them. Asterisk it hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't just being shut out, I was being cast aside. And for what? For not giving in to an expectation that wasn't mine to meet. I realized then that maybe it wasn't just about the birthday party anymore. It was about how my family saw me, how they viewed my worth, how easily they dismissed my feelings when they didn't align with their desires. It stung more than I expected, but it also woke something in me. I couldn't keep fighting for their approval when it clearly wasn't mutual. I had spent years pretending I was okay with their constant demands, their assumptions that I would always be there, always willing to step in. But the truth was, I didn't owe them that anymore. Not my money, not my time, not my happiness. The day after I saw that post, I sat down and wrote a letter. A long one. I poured everything into it, the hurt, the frustration, the realization that I was never going to be the same person I was before this all happened. I told them that I needed space, that I needed to find myself again without constantly bending to their expectations. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally standing up for myself. I sent it. The silence after I hit send was deafening. The days that followed felt like a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. I had taken a step I never thought I would, saying no, setting a boundary, and finally breaking free of the role I had been trapped in for so long. But now, I had to live with the consequences of my actions. The silence from my family was heavier than I had imagined, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake. Maybe I had gone too far. Maybe, in standing up for myself, I had irreparably damaged our relationship. But then, just as I was starting to second-guess myself, I received a text from my mom. It was short, almost too short, but it felt like a small olive branch. Asterisk, we need to talk. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? Asterisk, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had no idea what kind of conversation this would be. Was this an attempt at reconciliation? Or would they just pile more guilt on me, making me feel like I was the one who had torn the family apart? Either way, I knew I couldn't back down now. I had already shown them a version of me that was real, unfiltered, and unapologetic. There was no going back. The next day, I met my mom at a quiet cafe, and as I sat down across from her, I noticed her nervous fidgeting. She didn't look at me the way she normally did, with that forced smile and the unspoken judgment in her eyes. There was a vulnerability there that I hadn't seen in a long time. Your father and we've been talking, she began, avoiding eye contact. And we realized maybe we've been too hard on you. Too focused on what we wanted, instead of considering how you felt. I didn't know what to say at first. I was taken aback. After all the guilt trips, the pressure, the manipulations, hearing her admit that was unexpected. But it also wasn't enough. I didn't want an apology that was wrapped in excuses or a simple sorry to smooth things over. I needed them to understand that this wasn't just about the money or a party, it was about respect. It was about boundaries. I know we've been hard on you, my mom continued. But it's just, we don't always know how to show it. We thought we were helping, but maybe we were just pushing too hard. I could hear the sincerity in her voice, but the pain in my chest wouldn't ease. I nodded slowly, taking in her words, but there was a part of me that wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. I had been hurt too deeply. I had felt abandoned, and the emotional scars weren't going to disappear overnight. I don't want to fight, I said quietly, after a long pause. But I need you to understand that I can't be the person you want me to be anymore. I can't keep sacrificing my own well-being to meet expectations I didn't set. I need space to be myself. To figure out who I am outside of this family dynamic. My mom finally met my gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she looked like she understood. Not fully, but enough. She didn't say anything else for a moment. We just sat there, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air between us. I think I get it, she said softly. I really do. I'm sorry for pushing you too far. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, and I didn't expect it to be. But it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again, like I wasn't constantly being pulled in 100 different directions. I still didn't know where things would go from here. The damage had been done, and there was no erasing the past. But for the first time, I felt like I had my footing again. I had drawn a line, and though it was messy, it was mine. We didn't walk out of that cafe with all our issues solved, but the conversation was the first real step toward healing, at least for me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I finally understood that my worth wasn't tied to their expectations. I was more than just the person they thought they could control. And for the first time, I was okay with that. After that coffee meeting, things didn't magically fix themselves, but there was a subtle shift. My mom's apology was a start, but it didn't erase the tension that still simmered beneath the surface. I wasn't expecting everything to be perfect right away, but I knew that I had done something important for myself. I had asserted boundaries, and for once, I felt like I was standing in my own life, not as a pawn in someone else's game. Over the next few weeks, I kept my distance from the family. I needed time to process everything, and to be honest, I wasn't sure if I was ready to dive back into the same dynamics. My phone buzzed with texts from my siblings, asking how I was doing, but I kept the conversations short, polite but distant. They all seemed to be tiptoeing around me now, unsure of what to say or how to approach me. They'd never seen me like this before. The sibling who always gave in, who always played along, was suddenly unavailable and firm. It was unsettling for them, and I wasn't sure if they would ever get used to this new version of me. Then, Jason reached out. It was a simple text, but it hit me differently than all the others. It wasn't filled with guilt or demands, just a simple "Hey, I've been thinking about everything. I'm sorry if I made you feel like you didn't matter. I was wrong." At first, I stared at the screen, not knowing how to respond. Part of me wanted to just ignore it, to let the silence stand as my answer. But then I realized that I couldn't keep running from these conversations if I wanted any chance of healing, both for me and for my relationship with him. "I appreciate that, Jason," I typed back slowly. "But I think we both need to understand that this isn't just about that birthday party. I need you to see that I've been putting myself last for a long time, trying to meet everyone's expectations. And I just can't do it anymore." The response came quickly. "I get that now. I really do. I'm sorry for everything I didn't see before. It's just hard to accept that things have changed between us." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It's not easy for me either. But maybe that's what needs to happen for us to move forward, you know? And just like that, we began a slow, fragile path to rebuilding. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We talked about the things we hadn't said, and the things we hadn't understood about each other. It was a hard conversation, but one that was long overdue. Meanwhile, my parents continued to tread carefully around me. There were more conversations, though they were never as deep or as open as the one with Jason. It was as if they were all waiting for me to take the first step back into their world, back into the role I'd always played. But this time, I wasn't going to be pushed. I would engage on my terms, when I felt ready. The emotional scars were still there. The pressure they'd put on me, the assumptions, the manipulations, they hadn't disappeared. But I had learned something valuable during those months of distance. I had learned that my life, my peace, and my happiness weren't something to be bargained for. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth the distance I had created. It wasn't easy, and I knew the road ahead would continue to be full of bumps. But at least now, I was walking it with the strength I had finally found in myself. I wasn't just a bystander in my own life anymore. I was the one calling the shots, setting the pace, and most importantly, learning to say no when it mattered. And that, I realized, was the most important thing of all. Months passed since that difficult period, and while the scars weren't gone, the weight they had carried around with them seemed to lighten. My relationship with my family wasn't perfect, but it was better. The silence had been broken, and the distance I'd put between us, though hard, had given me space to breathe, to think, and to stand my ground without fear of losing myself in the process. The interactions with my parents and siblings remained cautious, but they were different now. Jason and I had started to find a new rhythm in our relationship, one that wasn't based on expectations or the pressure to conform to roles that didn't fit me anymore. We talked, sometimes in awkward silences, but they felt real. They were conversations that I could walk away from feeling understood, even if they weren't always easy. My mom had started calling me more frequently, but she no longer tried to push me into anything. There was a gentleness in her voice that wasn't there before. She still didn't fully understand everything I'd gone through, but she was trying, and that was enough. The family dinners, the ones that once felt like walking through a minefield, became easier too. They didn't feel like a performance anymore, where I had to play the part of the dutiful daughter or the generous sibling. It was like we were all navigating new territory together, learning how to communicate without expecting anyone to sacrifice their boundaries for the sake of maintaining the family image. One Sunday, we all gathered for dinner at my parents' house, and for the first time, I felt like I could truly be myself. There was no tension, no underlying resentment. It was just normal. Jason cracked a joke, and my mom laughed, her eyes meeting mine with a look that said more than words ever could. For a moment, I realized how much I had missed these simple, unguarded moments. But the real change wasn't in the family gatherings or the dinners we shared. The real change was in me. I had finally learned to stand up for myself, to say no without guilt, and to claim my own happiness. It wasn't just about surviving the demands of my family anymore, it was about thriving in my own life, outside of their expectations. I had taken control, and even though the road had been long and painful, I knew it was the path I had to walk. I looked around that evening, at my family gathered around the table, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was out of place. I felt like I belonged, not because I was fulfilling their needs, but because I was being true to myself. And that, I realized, was the only way to find peace in any relationship, whether with family, friends, or even myself. I wasn't perfect. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew that challenges would always come. But I had finally given myself permission to stop bending to everyone else's will. I was allowed to live for me. And in that quiet moment, amidst the chatter and the laughter of my family, I understood that I had finally found my own peace.